Welcome to another episode of Kitchen Sink Dharma. And if you've spent much time with Buddhists, you've probably come across the term emptiness. And the word might sound a bit off-putting because, certainly in the West, the word has connotations of loneliness or despair or depression, as in, I feel all empty inside. And it can also be a concept within Buddhism that can be quite intimidating. Sometimes it's described as the ultimate teaching. And it's talked about as though it's something quite mysterious and difficult to understand, and it really isn't that complicated. So in Pali and Sanskrit, the word is very similar, shunyata. And in this context, shunyata simply means empty of independent existence. So it's about recognizing that everything arises out of conditions. Nothing appears from nowhere. And everything is affected by everything else. So if you understand interdependence, if you understand causality, then you understand emptiness. Because we're all here today as a result of countless causes and conditions, and everything exists because of a whole series of things that existed before it. Nothing actually has a fixed, unchanging essence. Everything changes. If the causes and conditions change, then the thing itself will change. And that's true of objects, processes, everything, whether that's a person or a tree or a car or a psychological process. So our thoughts are actually very much conditioned by other circumstances. Now, the obvious question here might be, so what? What's that got to do with meditation? What's it got to do with mindfulness? So the point of understanding and knowing about emptiness is to relieve distress. It's to make us less miserable. And I'm going to try and explain why. Understanding emptiness means understanding that every phenomenon is a process. It's an unending process, and that includes us. And there isn't any extra separate bit of us that's called the self. There's not a thing that exists inside us that we can point to and say, oh yeah, that bit there is the self. Now, Buddhist teachings break down our experience of being a self into 5 parts. It's commonly known as the 5 aggregates or the 5 khandhas. And these are just 5 aspects of our experience that come together. And firstly, there's the body and the senses. Secondly, the feeling of things being pleasant or unpleasant. Thirdly, there's a process of recognition, in other words, our immediate reaction to the world that we encounter. And then fourth, there's the habits and patterns of mind that we have that are shaped by the past. And then fifth, finally, there's consciousness, our awareness of mental and physical feelings. Now, these 5 aggregates, these 5 aspects of experience are ever-changing. They're impermanent. They change all the time. And although we often say things like, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, we're actually not the same person we were 10 minutes ago, because none of these elements remain the same for more than a few seconds. Our experience is constantly flowing and changing. And solidity, permanence, these are mistaken perceptions that we have. What we experience through our senses and how we respond to that is constantly changing. We could be described as pure process, and everything about our experience is ephemeral. And although this isn't always reflected in the way that we think and the language that we use, we might understand that on an intellectual level. So if you stop and think about it, the way that we view the world is a bit strange, it's a bit distorted. And the stories that we project onto other people and things, that they have a particular essence that's unchanging. Mostly not true, they're not accurate. And particularly the way that we divide the world into those who are with us and those who are against us. You know, it's very binary, what's good and what's bad. It doesn't make any sense. It gives rise to all sorts of unhelpful ideas and conflicts. And of course, the feelings that we obsess about, the pleasant feelings, the unpleasant feelings that we think about so much, they're mostly fleeting. They don't last very long, and we take our emotions very seriously. But the way that we're feeling now or at any time isn't going to last forever. The greed, the insecurity that drives an awful lot of behaviour in the world all comes from a mistaken view about how things are. We bring a bit of a subjective bias to the sense data that we receive, the sights, the sounds and smells and so on, the moment it reaches us. And this can cause endless stress and endless unhappiness. And we categorize things as good or bad, or this belongs here or it doesn't belong here. Most of the time we see everything through the lens of me. How will this affect me? What will people think of me? Does this person like me? And most of this isn't really necessary. I think it's something we've evolved with, because for most of our human history, life was dangerous. We had to be wary in order to survive. Our status within the tribe or the community determined whether or not we survived and reproduced. And if we were shunned by the group, back in our primitive history, that would mean banishment and death. So no wonder we have a negativity bias. No wonder we're preoccupied with status. No wonder we worry about looking bad. And what that means is we're just constantly creating and recreating a sense of self. And it might be a positive sense of self, or it might be a negative one, but either way it can keep us very busy. It can take a great deal of our energy. And either way, it isn't actually who we really are. So these stories that we tell ourselves can really weigh us down. They limit us. And there's a great deal of stress arises from seeing ourselves as one self in competition with other selves. So we objectify other people, even though actually they're part of us and we're part of them. And sometimes we think if we separate ourselves off and build a big wall, it's going to make us safe. And there's a great example I was reading about. Some of the wealthiest people in America, in places like Silicon Valley, are getting ready for the end of civilization. And you have these wealthy survivalists who are investing huge amounts of money in bunkers and buying up locations that they think are going to be safe from the effects of things like climate change. And there's these luxury apartment complexes built in underground silos, and they're going to have armed guards outside. It really is taking the idea of gated communities to the next level. And of course the focus isn't how we can make things better, or how we can make the changes that we need to do things like reverse climate change, or make the world more equal or more secure. Instead it's on how can I separate myself and my family off so at least we're safe. And I know it's understandable to want to protect themselves and their families, but this approach doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter how high you build your wall. We're still completely dependent on each other. We're still part of the same system. So there's nothing cold or dissociated about an understanding of emptiness. It's what allows us to be responsive, connected human beings. And once we stop solidifying our perceptions, once we loosen up a bit and stop seeing everything in terms of us and them, and accept the reality of emptiness and impermanence, then that prepares the ground for kindness and friendliness and compassion. So one of my previous teachers encouraged us to think about emptiness or shunyata as spaciousness. And in this context, spaciousness means loosening our grip. It means letting go of some of our fixed perceptions and being a bit less black and white, letting go of I as a fixed identity. Because when we identify with our stories, that tends to take up all the available space. It doesn't leave very much room for fresh encounters with others. And seeing the world through the lens of spaciousness counteracts that tendency. It means we could just relax and enjoy our world a bit more. So here's an example, a simple example. I was out on my bike recently. I was cycling through North Shields and I was minding my business. And somebody in a big car, big SUV, drove past me and honked the horn. And of course, when you're on a bike and somebody sounds the horn next to you, the body reacts, you get a fright, the heart rate goes up. And then there's all sorts of different ways that this can go. Because obviously you can react angrily, you can decide that person is an idiot or something, typical 4x4 driver. You could say typical male driver or typical female driver or whatever it is. You can blame yourself, you can say, what did I do to make them sound their horn? And you can even spend the rest of the day reliving it and bathing in anger and hostility. But if you experience something like that through the lens of emptiness, it's very different. It's possible to bring some sense of don't know mind to it, a mind that doesn't necessarily have the answers. A mind without preconceptions. I don't know why that person sounded their horn. Don't even know for sure that they were honking at me. They might have been sounding their horn because they saw someone they knew. They did it for a reason, or there may have been many reasons. It happened as a result of countless causes and conditions. I don't know that person, and they certainly won't match any label I could put on them. And at that moment, their senses, their feelings, their reactions, their past experiences converged, and it made sense from their point of view right then to sound the horn. And again, forgive me if it sounds like I'm going on about this too much, but I think it's important as an example. No doubt that person and I have a lot in common. They probably love their kids, they worry about the future. Maybe they're just as complicated and vulnerable and filled with hope and love as I am. You could say I'm overthinking. What's the big deal? There's no harm in me just calling them an idiot. Might make me feel better. But if we really examine our experience, we see that's not true. Because we're constantly encountering people and things that cause us to react. Pretty much all day, every day. And carrying hostility, carrying judgment around with us all day places a really heavy burden on the heart. So what happened when I was out on my bike just happened. It wasn't an attack on me. I don't have to defend myself by weaving stories about it. I don't need to take it personally. Taking it personally is more likely to give rise to unethical behaviour. So if we can relax our concept of self and other, good and bad, us and them, there isn't really any place left for ill will. So emptiness and spaciousness feature a lot in later forms of Buddhism, for example in Mahayana teachings. But it's also right at the beginning, right in the early stuff in the Pali Canon. And particularly there's two texts, the Mahashunyata Sutta and the Chula Sunyata Sutta. You'll find a description by the Buddha of meditation practice leading to increasingly subtle experiences of emptiness. And we see that emptiness is an insight that can arise from our meditation practice. And we're encouraged to make some space for seclusion, to sense into emptiness. And when we slow down, give ourselves some peace and get some clarity, then to just observe our experience. And then we start to see the way that we construct the world with our thoughts. We're encouraged to avoid doing that, to avoid just instantly judging whatever arises, and not to project our thoughts onto our experience, not to add anything that distorts our experience, not to see any essence in things. In other words, not to see something as being essentially good or essentially bad. Just to understand that all experience is transient. It's all impermanent. One way we do this is through a very open kind of meditation without any object, just taking everything in at once. All the sensations, all the sounds and sights, smells, the feelings, all the things happening in the mind, taking it all in at once. It's a kind of wide open mindfulness. And we might have to ground ourselves first to be able to do this. It's not the easiest practice. Some seclusion does help here, but if we can perceive what's happening in the mind and the body as far as possible without colouring it too much with our perception, then the experience becomes a bit less distorted and we can really tune into the senses and the mind becomes very still. And the point of all this is to shift our understanding of emptiness just from an intellectual one to one that we can actually experience, to an embodied understanding. And as Thich Nhat Hanh said, emptiness is not something to be afraid of. So that's what I wanted to say about emptiness, and thank you as always for listening. Hope you can join me again soon.